Us for this launch of our one of our latest Adelphi books, North Africa in Transition, The Struggle for Democracies and Institutions, edited by Ben Fishman. I said one of the latest, it's the latest. I'm Mark Fitzpatrick, the Executive Director of the IISS America's Office as of December. I think you all know the Adelphi series is the flagship publication of the IISS. It's our contribution, one of the contributions to policy-relevant original academic research. The book is available at the back afterwards or online at IISS.org. So the three speakers have extensive experience in the countries that are the theme of this book. As noted, Ben Fishman, the editor of this Adelphi book, he served for 4 years at the NSC, the National Security Council, including as director for North Africa and Jordan from 2012 to 2013, after which he became a IISS Consulting Senior Fellow, and it was in that capacity that he edited this book. Haim Malka is a contributing author of North Africa in Transition. He's a Senior Fellow and Deputy Director of the Middle East program at CSIS, where he oversees the program's work on the Maghreb. His areas of research include religious radicalization, government strategies to combat extremism, violent non-state actors, and North African politics and security. John Durocher was not a contributor to the book, but he's going to contribute some policy perspectives. He's a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Egypt and Maghreb Affairs. Previously, he served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. He also served in Baghdad from 2009 to 2010 as Minister Counselor for Economic Coordination. So the book that we're going to talk about today examines how the politics, security, and economies have changed in the North African states of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. Ben and Haim will speak directly on how the themes of the book relate to current developments and policy implications. John will then follow by offering the U.S. view of priorities and challenges in the region and where North Africa fits into the landscape of U.S. priorities in the Middle East. We've asked each of the three to speak for no longer than 10 minutes so that we can have a half an hour or so for discussion and Q&A afterwards. So Ben, please kick us off.
Well, thanks, Mark. And thanks especially to IISS for supporting this project. I have a number of people to thank that shouldn't go against my time.
Okay.
To John Chipman, first of all, for supporting this project and envisioning it, to Steve Simon for help kicking it off, to Nick Redman and his team for shepherding the publication, and most importantly to 6 great authors who contributed the chapters to this volume. Haim, to my left, is going to be representing all of them, so he has a long list to cover. And most importantly, also thanks to John Durocher for participating today. I worked with John for more or less 2 years, I believe, in government. He was a fantastic colleague. Periodically, the White House and the State Department, as you know, have differing opinions about policy directive and directions, and John made that process as easy and smooth as one could hope. So I want to outline the major themes of the book. First, we wanted to look at North Africa or the Maghreb, excluding Egypt, to trace the key events since the uprising in 2010, 2011, to identify the key distinctions among the 4 countries that Mark noted. The central premise was to examine what is commonly referred to as the Maghreb, to analyze the key differences about why some of these states survived the so-called Arab Spring and how, and why some did not. Looking toward lessons applicable to the broader region, the bulk of the chapters deal with the history of these countries and serve as kind of primers for the region, the countries and their developments from 2011 to 2015. But I'm going to speak about more broader lessons and overviews. Let me focus for a minute on one of the key lessons. What became clear when doing these comparisons was the difference between the institutions of government among the different states. One a monarchy, obviously, one an oligarchy, a weak authoritarian state, and obviously Gaddafi's whatever you define it or call it. The monarchy and oligarchy rebounded. The Ben Ali regime collapsed, what with enough structure to initiate a tense but lasting transition. And Gaddafi's system, built around the structure of one family, left chaos despite the enthusiastic rebellion. This is obviously not the only factor that translated to the different outcomes of those states, but one of the main ones that I focused on in the conclusion. So very briefly, if institutional differences are the key lessons from the post-2011 period, then I believe institution building should be the key lessons to going forward. That means gradual but steady reform of key political, economic, and security institutions that will not be dramatic revolutions, but will slowly, with the investment of leaders and populations alike, demonstrate change in a positive direction. The last observation is that these changes have to take place on an intra-regional level as well. There's little regular cooperation among these states, certainly not at an economic level, and at a security level, only ad hoc arrangements. Any outside effort to engage the Maghreb should seek to regularize these engagements, perhaps using the Libya crisis as a common ground. And obviously, as John will elaborate later, I assume, we argue substantially that the U.S. needs to invest more time and energy with its European allies on the Maghreb and the region. A few remarks about Libya. Chaim and I have divided, I'll get the Libya portion and he'll take the remainder of the states. I have the luxury of not following currently the day-to-day developments in Libya, negotiations about the governing council and the plus or minus 32 members or the cabinet, et cetera. I think the UN negotiating deal is certainly a positive development, but obviously has a long way to go. What I do want to do is make a few observations and lessons learned about our past effort to try to build up a transitional government, and how and where we succeeded and how we fell short. First, there's always going to be a balance and tension between seeking Liberian ownership and pressing them forward to do things from an international perspective. That applies equally to the UNSMEL-led negotiations, as well on a political level, as well as future efforts by the international community to initiate security assistance, economic assistance, et cetera. On balance, I think having witnessed the failure of these previous efforts, I think we need to be still sensitive wherever possible to Libyan sensitivities, but overall we need to be more assertive than we were in the past, less deferential to the UN-led process, and more working more closely with our key allies in Europe. In other words, we need to press more aggressively. Two, we need to take more political and security risks in engaging with it. That means we need to work more closely with the government, get inside the ministries. John may be able to reflect from his Baghdad experiences what worked and what didn't work in Iraq. But we had very, very little interaction with the government in Libya in 2011, 2012, even to 2013. What we did work in certain economic sectors, I think we had limited progress. In the security arena, we had much less. So that should be a key condition of our engagement with the interim Libyan authorities. Third, we need better coordination within the international community writ large. I think that has improved under the new UNSPIL leadership, as far as I understand. But still, each country has a tendency to want to pursue their own efforts. This is a natural phenomenon that we experience across government, but we need to make a better effort to, among our allies, to divide certain sectors among us and hold regular accountability. And fourth, what flogging horse that I unsuccessfully tried to emphasize in 2012 period was to try to empower local governments at the expense of a paralyzed national government. That means decentralizing as much as possible, giving local councils the authority and budgets to do local projects that they themselves identified. I remember I was in Benghazi in 2012, shortly before our tragedy, with a mission, and met the local council there, and they had a huge range of ideas that they wanted to implement. But the problem was, for a country as rich as Libya, they had no budget authority, and the federal government refused to give them any. So that's a new line approach. I think for the most part, the GNA should devolve as much authority to the local councils as possible and focus themselves on federal projects like infrastructure, telecoms, etc. And certainly, obviously, the security. With that, I'll turn it over to Chaim. Obviously, happy to answer any questions on the broader book that you should all buy, and it's only, I don't know what we're charging it for it here, but it's $8 on the iTunes or Kindle. So we'll sign copies of the Kindle.
Go ahead, Chaim. I know you wrote the chapter on Morocco, but you have to represent 5 other authors as well. But you only have 10 minutes. You can't.
Okay. I'll make it quick then.
Yeah.
3 countries in 10 minutes. But thank you, Mark, and thank you to IISS. I also want to thank Ben, who had the vision to put this project together. And I wholeheartedly agree with you that we need more investment in North Africa and the Maghreb. And to do that, we need greater understanding of the regions and of the region and the trends and events there. And I think this book helped contribute to a better understanding in Washington. So I applaud you for that. As Ben mentioned, we had a division of labor. He got the short end with Libya, and I get to take Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia. And Ben asked me not to analyze what happened in the past couple of years, but to look forward. So I thought, well, okay, trying to forecast, predict what's going to happen in the Maghreb in 2016. First thing that came to my mind was it's kind of like predicting the stock market. How's the stock market going to do before the 500-point drop this morning? But there's a lot we don't know, like predicting the market, looking at the Maghreb. There's a lot we don't know. We don't know if President Bouteflika is going to remain in office, if his health will allow him to remain in office. We don't know if there's going to be some sort of a black swan or some kind of a spark in any one of these countries that creates a conflict, an intense conflict between citizens and rulers. But we have some indicators and we have some trends that point to a very volatile year ahead. There will be occasional gains, modest, positive movement, but overall it's going to be a rocky year characterized by uncertainty, insecurity, and sharp declines. Now, I'm not going to give you any stock tips right now, but I am going to highlight 4 trends and indicators that I think are important to watch that signal a volatile year ahead in the Maghreb. The first is the continued appeal of radical ideology and jihad in Syria and Libya, which heightens the threat of violent attacks and terrorism in every country of the region. Part of the problem is that the Islamic State, Daesh, and the idea of radical ideology solves and provides answers to a wide range of religious, social, economic, personal problems that drive radicalization in the first place and makes it appealing to young people in the region and makes it very difficult for governments, including our own government, to combat effectively. I don't want to overemphasize the trend of violence, of jihadism in the region, but it's there, it's in the background. We already know that Tunisians make up one of the largest groups of foreign fighters in Syria and in Libya. And while Syria remains the focal point for jihadist recruitment, most importantly for Daesh, I think Libya is becoming an increasingly attractive magnet for North Africans and from Sahelian would-be jihadists simply because of its accessibility and the ease of reaching Libya compared to the ease of reaching Syria these days. So Libya as a focal point for regional jihad, attracting Maghrebis, Algerians, Tunisians, Moroccans, and others is going to be very important. Part of the problem I see with this is in the response. The counterterrorism response that's going on now is intense, and the tempo is reminiscent in many ways of the arrest campaigns in 2003 following the Casablanca bombings, where thousands of people were rounded up in Tunisia, in Morocco, and elsewhere, and several countries passed harsher, more intense counterterrorism laws, which allowed them to detain people. And we saw a widespread rounds of arrest that actually contributed to radicalization and reinforced many of the problems that were faced in the region and contributed jihadists that were eventually let out of prison in 2011 in Tunisia, some that were pardoned in Morocco, that ended up taking a path of jihad and going back to Syria or going back to Libya. So the counterterrorism response is increasingly intense and I think reinforces radicalization rather than provides an answer to it. Jihadist groups are now calling for violent attacks in every single country of the Maghreb on social media, through videos and other propaganda. So there is an intense effort underway. And some of these countries, Tunisia in particular, are not particularly well equipped to deal with the problem of terrorism, both on the border areas, but also in urban areas where the human intelligence apparatus of Tunisia, for example, is very lacking at the moment. Residents are afraid to cooperate with the police in some of the larger urban neighborhoods where jihadists have sought refuge, and there is limited cooperation among the different security and intelligence agencies as well, which limit the counterterrorism effort. Again, I don't want to overplay the role of security, but it's certainly a big one. The second trend, which I think points to volatility, is an ongoing failure of governments to make difficult policy choices and decisions on critical economic and social issues that contribute to youth marginalization and radicalization. There's a plus and a negative here, because on the plus side, this drive for consensus and compromise has prevented a further decline into violence and conflict. We saw that in Tunisia in 2012 and 2013, where the two main political factions, Ennahda and Nida Tunis, came together in the spirit of compromise to prevent further bloodshed and crisis and conflict. In Algeria, this drive for consensus is the name of the game and epitomizes the entire political apparatus and economic apparatus. But the failure to make decisions and set policy on controversial issues like privatization, like liberalization, like reforming state-owned enterprises, on investment laws, on banking laws that could help spur the economy and diversify the economies in places like Tunisia and Morocco, are actually prolonging many of the socioeconomic challenges that drive, again, marginalization, radicalization, and fuel a whole range of grievances. The third indicator is on the economic side. Now, most forecasts from the World Bank are showing modest economic growth in each of the Maghreb countries. I think those forecasts are a little too rosy, in part because the four main contributors to GDP in each of the Maghreb countries is either uncertain throughout 2016 or is clearly declining. The first is tourism, which makes up an important chunk of Tunisia and Morocco's GDP. In Tunisia, roughly 7% last year, in Morocco, roughly 9%. But there has been a steady decline over the last few years in visitors, tourist visitors in each of those countries, primarily driven by security fears. So despite the fact that Morocco, for example, is investing heavily, millions of dollars, to boost up their tourism infrastructure, we can expect a decline, most likely, in revenues across the region for 2016. Remittances are another important source of revenue in each of these countries, which is dependent on the European economy. So again, uncertainty over European economic growth is going to affect the amount of remittances that are available to the economies in the Maghreb. Gulf support, aid and investment is another big question mark. In 2011, the GCC states granted Morocco $2.5 billion over 5 years as a generous aid package. Last year, Saudi Arabia announced that they were going to invest $22 billion in Morocco's military defense industry to help it build out a domestic defense industry. That's on the positive side, but with oil prices sinking to $28 a barrel and an oversupply in the market, in global markets, it's unclear how GCC states are going to prioritize their aid and investment in the Maghreb and the broader Middle East over the next year. So again, a big question mark and uncertainty. Which brings us to the fourth point of oil. Oil makes up 60%, oil revenues, hydrocarbon revenues, make up 60% of Algeria's government spending. Oil has been the key driver of stability in Algeria over the last decade, and I can't overemphasize this point enough. It was Abdelaziz Bouteflika that brought stability to Algeria after 10 years of civil war and violence on the heels or on the wave of high oil prices that allowed the government to spend generously on infrastructure, on social services, and to essentially provide for many of the socioeconomic grievances and demands that people had that were potentially driving instability. The inability of Algeria to continue funding these kinds of socioeconomic projects and distributing energy rents could be potentially destabilizing. In 2015, Algeria already had a $50 billion budget deficit, which caused it to spend down some of its foreign reserves. But this is a critical point to watch in Algeria. And then fourthly, and it's important, if I may just backtrack for a moment, Algeria in many ways is the linchpin of the region. I was in Tunisia in September, and I had a conversation with somebody, a guard at the British Embassy. And we were just standing around talking about the security environment, and he said he was complaining about how the situation in Tunisia was so difficult. And then he said, but thank God for Algeria, thank God for Abdelaziz Bouteflika. The stability in Algeria is helping the situation in Tunisia. So the flip side of that, and the fear is that if Algeria becomes destabilized, it's going to affect every single country in the Maghreb and Sahel, and potentially Europe as well. And then finally, the fourth trend that I see affecting volatility in the Maghreb is that the uprisings of 2010 and 2011 did not sufficiently address popular demands or change the status quo for most people. So there's a lot of unfinished business in the region. We're hearing a lot about Tunisia and the slide back potentially to authoritarianism and the Ben Ali system. I wouldn't put too much stock into that at the moment. I wouldn't overemphasize that. But we see the latest IRI poll that came out recently indicating that 83% of Tunisians that were polled see their country moving in the wrong direction. We see the riots and the clashes in Kasserine this week between protesters and the security forces as well, indicating that the socioeconomic demands, the marginalization, none of those issues have really been addressed by the state in any of these countries. And I think Morocco highlights this in an important way, and this was the argument of the chapter that I wrote in the book, was that the reforms that the monarchy put forward in 2011 did a lot to help stabilize Morocco at a very volatile time in the region. But those reforms were focused on constitutional and political issues, which satisfied a small part of the demands of most of the protesters in Morocco. They didn't address many of the socioeconomic issues, the calls for justice, the calls for dignity, which are much less tangible and much more difficult to measure, but which really drive people in Morocco and in the region. And without addressing those less tangible issues like justice and dignity, corruption, favoritism, that it's likely that we'll see another round of protests in the future. And the question in Morocco is whether those protests in the future are going to call for more revolutionary change or the evolutionary change that we saw protesters calling for in 2011. I think we're also seeing a lot less tolerance in the region. We have a tendency in Washington to focus on democracy and political reform, but I think there is less and less space for dissent and less space for less tolerance among the political elite across the region. We're seeing harassment of artists and musicians and journalists in every country. We're seeing harassment of the LGBT community. And I think what this signals is growing insecurity and fear among the ruling elite. So to sum it up, the year ahead is going to be volatile. The challenge ahead for governments and for the U.S. is not to panic and not to exaggerate either the ups or downs and the wild swings that we're inevitably going to see, but to take a long-term approach. That means not letting the volatility and fear of instability paralyze decision-making and choices that are critical to addressing a long list of grievances and challenges that over time can build more security and growth. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chaim. John, you've heard some suggestions for policy and not to overreact. How are you reacting?
Well, first, Mark, thanks for the invitation. I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate the book, which I was telling Ben I haven't read it all, but I went through a lot of it and I found it, it's useful, and certainly, Ben will remember this. Sometimes it's hard in the day-to-day of getting through what it takes to implement policy. It's hard sometimes to step back and take a look at a bit of a bigger picture and keep a perspective on things, which I think the book makes a really constructive contribution to, I certainly appreciate it and appreciate the opportunity to talk today. I mean, just from looking back at sort of the themes of the book and just some of what Ben and Hyman said today, and as I sort of prepared for the conversation today, a few things struck me. It's hard to talk about a Maghreb policy. All of these countries came out of the recent upheaval in all such different places. It's good to look holistically, but you really have to take each country's situation individually and work with it as in the most productive way possible. So it can be hard to talk, except in very broad terms, on a Maghreb policy, rather than talking about policies with individual countries. But I mean, a few things I'll mention. What we're looking to do is build effective partnerships with all of these countries in their various individual states at the moment, helping build government capacity, build governance capacity, help build the institutions that make the title of the book, help find ways to spur economic growth to address the issues that a lot of people have already raised. A major part of that has to be assisting in the security effort to counter the violent extremism that's already been discussed, and finding a way to do so that does so effectively and productively, and also takes into account the need to build the human rights environment that contributes to that effort, which is always something that we try to do. Helping them deal on the security sense with border security and with deal with all of the flows, the drug flows, the people smuggling, all of the things that may not be indigenous but that cause such problems throughout the region. And then on the economic side, a lot of the challenges have already been mentioned, and I won't go back to them again. But doing what we can in partnership with these countries to take down barriers for trade and investment. It's been mentioned. One of the things I was going to highlight, how little intra-regional trade there really is, and we think that very much holds countries back. A lot of youth unemployment. Some economic structures in some places that are not very flexible and not very welcoming don't create the right environment to invite investment. One thing that hasn't been mentioned, but I think that falls in some of the things you mentioned, is how much these countries' economies are tied to their largest trading partner, which is of course in Europe, and how the ups and downs there have such a knock-on effect on what goes on locally. And then I think it's worth saying that key to all of this, and I don't think my colleagues up here would disagree, is the whole situation in Libya and how much, most immediately for Tunisia in the countries we're talking about, but very broadly in the region, how the instability in Libya has the potential to cause, to make what the other countries want to accomplish that much harder. That not only for Libya itself, but for the broader region needs to be a very big focus for us, and it is. Just to briefly, some of this stuff has been mentioned, so I don't want to repeat too much, and I don't want to take time away for questions, but just to highlight how different some of these countries are. Morocco is already a major non-NATO ally of the United States. It's been a strategic partner for some time. It has an FTA with the U.S. It's always looking for ways to take advantage of that FTA to build its economy. But it still has some of these problems that I mentioned a few minutes ago like youth unemployment and the ties to Europe's economy as its major trading partner that it has to address. It's got it has its own concerns with the broader extremism problem in the region. That's definitely true. Algeria is a country that we're looking to build our partnership with. We've found Algeria to be a very useful partner for discussions about Libya and working on the Libya issue, and very ready to talk to us about that. and they've worked hard from where they sit on the situation in Mali, which is very useful. They're joining up in things like the Trans-Saharan Counterterrorism Partnership and Global Counterterrorism Forum and other fora to help move things ahead. We want to engage more with Algeria economically, but reform is needed there as well, and we're always taking advantage of whatever fora we can. We know the Algerians are interested to talk about how we might move forward on the kinds of bureaucratic and regulatory reforms that Algeria can use to really diversify its economy away from the dependence on oil and to create jobs and so on, which we think would be useful. Tunisia, we were talking a little bit before we came out here about the rightful attention that Tunisia is getting these days, and it's rightly been recognized, whether you look at the Nobel Prize or other things for the extraordinary changes that have taken place there. But it is it faces an awful lot of challenges, which we all realize. Again. Some of these things have already been mentioned, and I won't belabor it, but internal economic challenges, unmet expectations of the revolution and so on. But we've had a really productive, we think we have a really productive relationship with the Tunisians. Tunisia recently became a major non-NATO ally. We are working hard with our assistance program to boost assistance where we can, both on the security side and on the economic development side. The Tunisians are trying to tackle some of these reforms that you talked about. They've done the public-private partnership stuff. They've done some bank restructuring. There's still more to do on investment reform and so on. We want to partner with them on that and are ready to do so. And, just one thing to get back to something that Ben said early on in his remarks, we see partners, in all of these countries, but can only partner with them at whatever pace they're ready to go, but that's something we're anxious to do. On Libya, Ben said he had the luxury of sort of not having to follow each step forward and each step back and the vagaries of this process, but we do think that a lot has been accomplished over the past few months in cooperation with the UN and our other partners. Obviously, there's still a lot more to do. This is going to remain a challenge going forward, but we think the trend is going in the right direction, as difficult as things are. Our special envoy for Libya, Jonathan Weiner, is on his way back from conversations with European and other regional partners who share an interest in how we can help Libya recover and stabilize and move forward in a way so that all the aspirations of Libyans are addressed, and so that Libya's neighbors don't have to look so warily across their border. So it's definitely a challenging time. I don't disagree with that. I think that we have to take each of these challenges individually, which is what we're trying to do. And we've found in the time I've been doing this now for about a year and a half, we found welcome voices. Some paths move forward more quickly than other paths, but generally I'm feeling fairly positive about the direction of things. And maybe I should leave it at that before
we got one positive note in there, and that's not a bad place to put a punctuation mark.
He also works on Egypt. So.
I'll come in a minute here. I just wanted to, Ben, I was struck when you characterized the central theme of this book. You used the phrase, why some of the force survived and others didn't. And that verb survived struck me. When this all started in Indonesia, the Arab Spring, it gave people a sense of hope for the future, and to think that we're talking only about surviving, not benefiting from. I mean, John ended on a bit of a positive note, as he should, being a government official. But can you look forward? In transition, this transition period could go on for some time. At the end of it, will we look back maybe and say not only did some survive, but benefited from the changes?
Well, certainly, I would agree with the assessment that Tunisia is beyond surviving. I think particularly the passage unanimously of the Constitution in almost a year ago exactly, was a major step forward, again, on an institutional front, because that mitigates the risk for significant backsliding. Algeria is, I think, impossible to predict given the political situation and the soft coup rumors or the nature of that politics. I think the monarchy in Morocco, for the most part, is going slow and steady and has the least risks of political turmoil. And I told a discussion on Libya the other day that I was the least optimistic of at any point that I remember being, but that may be just a function of my mood at the time. Obviously, there are things that are going in the right direction, but I think for the most part, until we see the government actually back in Tripoli in a very relatively unified government that has some legitimacy on the ground, the steps forward and back maybe one step forward to 3 steps back or something like that, and I'm not willing to make that
Okay.
prediction.
Haim, you signaled you want to say something. All your indicators were negative, so
I thought they were positive. I thought I was optimistic. But, I mean, governments survive. That's what they try to do. That's their first ultimate aim, is survival. But I think one of the positive points that did come out, or sort of revelations that came out of the uprisings, is that popular pressure actually works in getting governments to move. Now, they might not always move in the direction that people want them to, but again, part of the argument that I made in the Morocco chapter was that time after time over the last 50 years, popular pressure has been successful in getting the monarchy to shift, to devolve some power, to give some concessions to opposition demands as a tool of survival. And I think we see the same thing in Algeria. We see the same thing in Tunisia now. Libya is not really a state by my definition, so I can't speak to it. But I think that is a positive, that popular pressure can work and can be effective in getting governments to make concessions, and that people are now more willing than ever to speak out against their governments.
Good. Okay, let's go to the audience. Gentleman in the second row here. And identify yourself. By the way, this is all on the record being streamed, so be erudite, concise, and witty.
I don't know about the latter part.
Okay, you have to be witty.
Joel Starr, I was a former Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Bush administration, and my question is for you, Secretary Durocher. Professor Stephen Cohen, an expert in Russian studies, recently remarked that the seeds of distrust between the United States, specifically Putin, and the Obama administrations were sown in Libya over the UN resolution that called for protecting civilians in a no-fly zone. And then in Professor Cohen's words, Gaddafi was blown out of his SUV, and China and Russia took note, thinking that why should we trust the United States in the future when they don't adhere to previous resolutions? And I was just kind of wondering what your thought was on that.
I will assure my Russia colleagues that I won't drive into their lane on U.S.-Russia relations. All I will say is what I've seen over the past, I started in this position about 18 months ago. And what I've seen particularly in the past 4 months or so is a recognition, different partners, different countries that have an interest in what's going on in Libya may come at this from slightly different directions, but I have seen generally a recognition that a solution needs to be found, and a solution that brings Libya a unified government that starts to restore institutions and starts to work on reducing the ungoverned space that allows extremism to grow, that that there's a recognition of the value of that in among all the partners that we deal with, and I think talk about being pessimistic or optimistic. I mean, some of where this comes from, where I saw all of these things when I got to this job 18, 16 months ago, and where we are today. As difficult as the Libya situation remains, I think that there has been a fair bit of movement forward, and I see fewer divisions among those partners than I did when I started out on this a while ago.
Okay, thank you. If we have time at the end, we might come back to you and ask you what you thought we should have done with Gaddafi. But let's go here to this gentleman and then in the third row.
Eric Schmidt with the New York Times. Another question for the Secretary. There are reports that foreign fighters are being turned away from Syria and actually going to Libya. I think the panelists may have alluded to it. How do you assess the situation of the Islamic State in Libya right now, and particularly in Sirte, and what's the U.S. government and its ally partners doing about that from a security standpoint?
Well, yeah, certainly, we have understandably a concern about the situation involving Daesh in Libya, in Sirte and elsewhere. It's something that we look at very closely. What we really need to do, and it may not be something that moves always as quickly as we would like, is we really need to work with Libyans, first and foremost, and with other concerned international partners to build the kind of unity government and partner in Libya that can act against this. Without such a partner, it's going to be very hard to move forward on these things. And so, that's one thing that unifies all in these discussions is an understanding of what threat that might pose and the need to tackle it.
What specifically is the U.S. government right now about a threat that's, by all accounts, is growing without any kind of constraints on it?
Well, without getting too far down into the weeds of things, just to reiterate, what we really need to do is build up and work towards creating, with Libyan partners, creating a unity government in Libya that represents all Libyans, that can exert its authority and start to restore sovereign authority over these empty areas and remove the kind of vacuum of authority that allows extremists to thrive.
Okay, thanks, John. In the third row here.
Yes, my name is Lorenzo Bruscaglia. I'm with Moroccan American Center. I have a question for Mr. Malka. You mentioned that Morocco in 2011 was able to push through a series of political and constitutional reforms, but didn't really address those intangible issues that you mentioned that dealt with justice, dignity, and corruption. In your view, given your research, what specific reforms could or should the government and the monarchy push through on these themes?
On the intangible issues, I think it's not only Morocco that's failed to address them, it's every country in the region. And this goes to issues starting with education and creating an education system that actually prepares students for jobs. It's about tackling corruption and the system of favoritism, which exists in every country, which gives access to certain people from certain families to certain resources and benefits, whether it's getting into a decent school or getting a government job. So I wrote the chapter on Morocco, but the issue of those intangible questions of justice and dignity apply to every country.
In the fourth row here.
Yes, my name's Evan, and I guess I went to Georgetown, and I'll represent them, let's say.
Representing Georgetown.
Yeah, instead of my employer, it's a better idea. So you mentioned intra-Maghreb unity. So in the past, there's been the Maghreb Union in the 80s that has failed to kind of take forth because of one principal issue, Western Sahara. So how can the Maghreb overcome the issue of Western Sahara? That seems to be the linchpin to Maghreb unity, in particular Algerian, Moroccan rapprochement. So thank you.
That sounds like a great question for the Deputy Assistant or the editor of this volume.
Ben, have a go at it.
We avoided the issue of Western Sahara in the book, for better or worse. The only observation I'll make is that diplomatic process was deeply underway both before the Arab Spring and after. So the argument I made was that issue didn't affect the political turmoil that couldn't be pointed at to affect the political turmoil that resulted in 2010, 2011 in the uprising. As for the Algeria-Morocco impasse, it is a key stumbling block to obviously intra-regional cooperation. I think Secretary Clinton made, I don't know if I would characterize it as a brief effort, but certainly an effort to engage more on the issue after she visited the region. Obviously, that didn't result in much, but I think a commitment, if I can recall from the time, to re-engage with a UN envoy. That hasn't led to any meaningful progress, but I think we have to find other centers of gravity to spur intra-regional cooperation, certainly on the security elements, if not on economics, and maybe around the issue of stability in Libya and ISIS.
Thanks, Ben. Did you want to take the invitation?
No, that's all right.
Okay. In the second to the last row there.
Ted Voorhees, Covington and Burling. No one has mentioned migration, which is a very new and potentially extremely important phenomenon. Would anyone want to hazard a prediction about the impact of developments on migration on the stability of the Maghreb region, in terms of whether the migration, will it continue, will it be stopped, will it be stifled in some way, will that have an impact?
Thanks for asking that question. It was on my list if we didn't get to it.
I'll take it.
Time, go ahead,
Sure,
please.
sure. It's a great point because we focused on security, we focused on politics, we focused on the economic challenges, but I think migration is another outlet for marginalized and people who have lost hope to make progress and to have a life within their current environment. So some people choose to go to Libya or Syria. Other people take their lives into their own hands and try to cross the Mediterranean Sea, which is equally perilous in many ways because thousands of people have died along the way. What's interesting is that there's been a bump in, the peak year for migration over the last 5 years was in 2011 when we saw tens of thousands of Tunisians leaving for obvious reasons. But over the last 6 months, there's been an increase in migration of North Africans to Europe as well. And we've seen a lot in the news recently bilaterally between Germany and Algeria, Germany and Tunisia, because what's happening is migrants from North Africa, from Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia in particular, are being classified, at least in Germany and potentially in other European countries, as coming from safe countries, which gives them a different status than migrants coming from Syria or Iraq or other war-torn countries, which means the migrants from war-torn countries are getting preferential treatment, whereas Moroccans and Tunisians and Algerians are either being turned away, being detained, and are face deportation by countries like Germany, for example, which are changing their their policies on migration. So I think this is going to be a increasingly important issue. And I think it's very much linked to the broader socioeconomic challenges, grievances, and drivers of radicalization that we sort of talked about.
So follow-up question, if I may. The attitudes in Germany have shifted radically since the New Year's Eve incidents in Cologne and elsewhere, and a kind of pushback against immigration, at least in the pages of the newspapers. Ben, you were, one of the themes was the need to work with European allies and be less deferential to, UN bodies that try to find more consensus globally or whatever. But do you think that there's new attitudes in Germany and elsewhere in Europe will make it harder, or will they be maybe even more inclined then to try to affect change internally in the countries that were the focus of your book?
To clarify the UN aspect, it was
I know I didn't get that right.
just the UNSMO piece, the
Okay.
UN mission in Libya, was given the lead in 2011, 2012, and that's a personality-based as much as an institutional-based issue, but it's not worth going into the depths.
Okay.
I think back to the other migration point that I wanted to make on the tail of Haim, a lot of the migration problems through Libya are attached to Sub-Saharan migration patterns that use traditional smuggling routes and take advantage of the Libyan anarchy and smuggling networks there. And that's also given the Europeans an impetus to provide more security. But all that is premised on a unity government, again, in close cooperation with the Libyans, so they can provide, the Europeans can help provide maritime security and border management training and all that stuff. But all that is premised on a unity government in a functioning country or semi-functioning country that can can at least make the requests to assisting countries that don't lead the assistance to be rejected by the Libyan people, and that's a very delicate situation. And that to emphasize my point about ownership, Libyan ownership versus outside insistence on making the programs actually start and work. I think we can't wait for the Libyans to ask. We have to lay the program that we're proposing on the table. We and our European friends and allies. And we have to engage with the Libyan population to gain their appeal to the extent possible. On ISIS, we have to be more assertive. I'm not a European expert, so I can't speculate about Germany and German attitudes toward migration or acceptance versus unacceptance. I think the Syria situation has overwhelmed the circuits about this much more so than the situation vis-a-vis the Maghreb. I can only, I'll defer to John, I think, on how much this is part of our EU dialogue with the Europeans on migration flows. But I for the most part, I think we're increasingly of the same mind. Germany is key to that. Germany, Italy, France, UK, Spain, I think as well, on the approach to Libya and the need to support the UN-led process on a unity government and then working forward from there.
Okay, well, thank you, Ben. We've come to an hour. We like to keep these timely so that we advertise that people can leave when we say they're going to leave, unless we have any final comments from John or Chaim. I think we'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for coming. This is a good book. I come at it from, yes, let's give a round of applause. I want to make one more pitch. I don't know much about North Africa. I found it very interesting book. The next in the Adelphi series will be a kind of a similar book. This one focused on Egypt, and again, a collection of different authors bringing a perspective on it. Other upcoming book launches here, watch this space, will be our annual Military Balance publication in early March. We've got a publication on cybersecurity, a strategic dossier that we will be launching. We'll be launching my own next book about proliferation potential in Northeast Asia. So keep on the mailing list, buy the book on your way out, and again, thanks for coming. And thank you again.